Well, good evening, friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it is a joy to welcome you tonight. I'm coming to you from historic Lamoni, which I couldn't be more excited about. Joining me today is my co-host, Lexi Frazier. Lexi is a former student in the Alma Blair internship program, and she's joining us from Ohio. Welcome, Lexi. In addition to Lexi, it's a joy to welcome back Seth Bryant, who is also joining us from Ohio. Seth is a former site director at the Kirtland Temple and a former board member of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. So welcome back, Seth. I'm excited to share this evening that we are extending the fall lecture series to include another lecture. Mark your calendars for Tuesday, November 28th, when we host Lachlan Mackay. Lach will give us an update on the extended research that he and Ron Romig have been doing over the last year. If you recall, we hosted these two in August of last year, where they shared their thoughts on a new daguerreotype of what they believed was Joseph Smith Jr. Well, their research has continued over the past year to include new findings and new thoughts on this artifact. So join us on Tuesday, November 28th to learn more. Alexi is dropping the registration link in the chat for you to sign up and save your online seat. You can also find the registration on the Fall Lecture Series webpage, which is also on our website. So November 28th is going to be a great night. Be sure to mark your calendars. We wouldn't be able to host lectures like tonight's program without your generous support. Your donations for the Fall Lecture Series go to developing new educational programs. They fund the Alma Blair Internship Program, a life-changing program. And they continue the Foundation's ongoing and never-ending support for the maintenance and preservation of the Community of Christ historic sites. So Lexi will drop the online donations link and mailing address into the chat. We thank you all for your generous support. Lastly, joining us tonight is my friend, Christin Mackay. I can't believe she's here to give this lecture, and I couldn't be more excited. Let me tell you about Christin. She is the director of the Joseph Smith Historic Site in Nauvoo, Illinois. She's a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, and she has published in Ancient Order of Things, essays on Mormon Temple from Signature Books in 2019. Along with her husband, Lachlan, Christin won the John Whitmer Historical Association's Best Article Award for her article called A Time of Transition, the Kirtland Temple 1838 to 1880. It's a fantastic article. I encourage you all to check it out. It's featured in the John Whitmer Journal in volume 18, which was printed in 1998. So be sure to check it out. Now, since she was a college student, Christin has lived on the Restoration Trail from Lamoni, Iowa, where she graduated from Graceland University with a BA in history, all the way to Kirtland, Ohio, and the Kirtland Temple, to Nauvoo, Illinois, where she is now at the Joseph Smith Historic Site. Tonight, Christin's lecture is called Mr. Smith Goes to Salt Lake City, Fred M. in Utah, 1904 through 1906. So welcome, Christin. I'll turn things over to you as we are all very eager to hear what you have to say and to learn more about Fred M's time in Salt Lake City.
Thanks, Barb. Good evening, everyone. I originally presented this paper last year as my presidential address at the 50th anniversary conference of the John Whitmer Historical Association. Fred M's personal effects are everywhere in my husband's family, including some of his journals. They cover his life from the 1890s up to the 1930s. Not all years have a journal, but 1904 captured my attention, and with the help of Fred's wife, Ruth's book on Fred, I found a snapshot of their lives to share with you this evening. Our nation has been so polarized in recent years. Fred and Ruth's experiences in Utah give us a look at how family can be polarized over religion, politics, and lived experiences, yet still manage to maintain cordial relationships and share a meal together. I'd like to acknowledge Anina Mackay, Fred M. and Ruth's granddaughter, and my mother-in-law, who provided photos of the family and personal correspondence between Fred and Ruth and family members. Thanks also to Rachel Killebrew and the Community of Christ Archives for assisting in the search for information. The Church History Library in Salt Lake City was gracious in sending electronic files of documents that helped to balance the story. In the Tabernacle, Salt Lake City, Brother Frederick M. Smith, who visited Salt Lake City, Utah, for the purpose of attending the Smith family reunion February 9th, attended the services in the Tabernacle on Sunday the 14th, and was the first speaker on the program, being followed by Charles Penrose, editor of the Deseret News. Brother Fred M. is the first elder of the reorganization to speak in the Tabernacle. Frederick Madison Smith, born January 21st, 1874, was the oldest surviving son of Joseph Smith III and the oldest surviving grandson of Joseph Smith Jr. and Emma Smith. Frederick was named after his late uncle, Frederick Granger William Smith, and his middle name came from his mother, Bertha Madison Smith. Fred grew up in Plano, Illinois, his birthplace, and Lamoni, Iowa, and eventually became the third president prophet of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now Community of Christ. He was the first graduate of Graceland College, received his master's degree from the University of Kansas, and his PhD in psychology from Clark University. He married Ruth Lyman Cobb in 1897 at her mother's home in Lamoni and preached his first sermon while on their honeymoon at a church reunion in Iowa. Ruth and Fred had two daughters, Alice Miramita Smith Edwards and Lois Audentia Smith Larson. In 1904, Fred, Ruth, and little Alice were living in Lamoni. Fred was an editor for the Saints Herald, the church periodical, and was serving as a counselor in the first presidency of the church. From the time he was a child, Fred knew that his destiny could likely be to become president prophet of the church like his father and grandfather before him. As his father's health began to suffer, Fred found himself taking on more responsibilities within the leadership of the church while attempting to balance his academic interests and family. Fred's first visit to Utah came in response to an invitation to attend a Smith family reunion. In a letter dated January 20th, 1904, President Joseph F. Smith wrote to President Joseph Smith III to ask his help in identifying the names of deceased family members so that temple work might be done for them. February 10th had been set aside as Smith Day in the Salt Lake Temple to complete the work. In the letter, President Joseph F. issues an invitation to Joseph III and all family members around Lamoni to come to Salt Lake in February. As there will be a large gathering of members of the family from all different parts for that day, we have arranged for a reunion of all members of the family to be held at the Beehive House on Tuesday, February 9th from 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. for the purpose of becoming better acquainted with each other and to commemorate the birth of our kinsman, the patriarch Hyrum Smith, it being the 104th anniversary of his birth. We extend to you and all the members of the family a cordial invitation to be present with us at this reunion. As we are not acquainted with members of the family in and around Lamoni, we ask you to kindly assist us so far as possible in extending this invitation to them that none may be slighted. Joseph III's reply to his cousin was somewhat non-committal. He wrote on January 28th, "My son Fred M. and myself are contemplating the idea of him making the trip and being present on the occasion to enjoy it so far as he may under the circumstances. Should he come, he would bring letters to yourself." Despite sometimes painful religious differences, Fred, like his father and uncles before him, ventured to Utah to meet with cousins and old-time church members. He described his journey to Salt Lake by train in his journal. He left Lamoni on February 5th and traveled through Iowa and Nebraska, stopping in McCook for supper. After supper, a Mr. Dundee asked me if I were the Smith registered from Lamoni. I said I was, and he then asked if I was one of the sons. I told him yes, and he said he was born and raised in Nauvoo, and until recently, his family had owned the ferry boat there. He said Pa, Joseph Smith III, and Uncle Alex were very much respected in Nauvoo. On February 6th, Fred describes how dry the landscape is and that there has been very little snow that winter. The train passes by ruins of sod houses and dugouts and tumbleweed piled up along the fences in western Nebraska. Fred writes to Ruth that afternoon and also makes some calculations about cargo and weight of the train as it passes by on the way to Denver. He described the mountains as follows. Over them hung clouds as a veil, so as though to shield their grandeur. Mountains where nature quit leveling or dumping ground. Or was it because that was where she had stored her treasures of precious metals and left them covered up, hidden from man? After spending the night in Denver, he continued his journey, arriving in Salt Lake late at night on February 7th, where he stayed at Hotel Wilson. The next morning, February 8th, we rose about 8 o'clock, and while Orser ate breakfast, I got a shave and shine. We then went out to look around. We went to the Temple Block. At the Information Bureau, we were turned over to a lady who showed us through the Assembly Hall and the Tabernacle. In the Tabernacle, I told her who I was, and she seemed surprised and pleased. The name was a Mrs. McCune. At the Bureau, she introduced me to Brother Jacques, who thought it was an honor to show a grandson of the prophet Joseph around. Mrs. McCune took us to the Beehive, which was originally Brigham Young's home in Salt Lake, where we met A.H. Lund, Mrs. Smith, and finally President Joseph F. Smith and Joseph F. Smith Jr. The latter took us in carriage to the Hotel Wilson, where I got my things. We left Orser there and returned to the Beehive, where they placed my things in the southeast room. Joseph F. Jr. then took me in carriage to various places around town, to Cousin John's, to the historian's office, George Smith's office, courthouse, and at 1 o'clock to the Beehive for dinner. The boys all come there for dinner. While Fred is in Salt Lake and staying at the Beehive house, Joseph F. Smith Jr., aka Joseph Fielding Smith, is his official host. Fred spent the rest of the day and evening sightseeing with Joseph Fielding and stopping by other relatives' homes. In the evening, they went to the theater built by Brigham Young, and he remarked that Joseph F. Smith and his family were in the box seats. The next morning, Joseph Fielding Smith took him to the church historian's office so that he could write home to Ruth. This would become routine during his visit. In the afternoon, he went back to the Beehive to prepare for the family reunion. As reported in the Deseret News, the reunion took place at the Beehive, and the program consisted of songs, recitations, reminiscent talks, and a short history of the Smith family to date. Fred was able to give a short address to the reunion, and other family members gave remarks about Hyrum, as it was the anniversary of his birth, and Mary Fielding Smith. According to the news, refreshments and handshaking continued well into the evening. The reunion was delightfully informal. On Wednesday, February 10th, Joseph F. Jr. and Fred toured the University of Utah and then spent the afternoon at the Great Salt Lake. Fred did stop that evening at the RLDS chapel, but found no one there, even though it was a Wednesday evening. Thursday, February 11th, was spent having his photo taken, meeting with the editor of the Tribune, stopping by the Herald building, and visiting more family members in Sugar House. In early evening, he and Joseph Fielding stopped by the Tabernacle, where he met the organist and choir directors. Fred was greatly impressed by the organ and the acoustics in the Tabernacle. In a letter dated February 12th, President Joseph F. Smith wrote to his son, Edward A. Smith, about the family reunion and Fred M.'s visit. We had a family gathering on the 9th, it being the 104th anniversary of the birth of my father, Hyrum Smith. We had over 200 relatives present, among them Fred M. Smith, the oldest son and counselor to my cousin Joseph Smith of the Reorganized Church. He is still visiting with us. He is about 30 years of age, is married, and has one child. We have not mentioned any of the differences of the views on religion, so that his visit may be as pleasant as possible. Last evening, he attended a brilliant gathering of MIA workers at Sister McCune's. He has nothing to do but enjoy himself if he will. I cannot guess what he will say about us when he returns home. Fred did note in his journal the evening spent at Sister McCune's. He felt the grandeur of the house was inappropriate. Church members shouldn't put on such a display of wealth. He also had a conversation with a woman and was surprised that even though they were a young person, they were comfortable with polygamy, though it had been against the law for many years. The rest of the week passed with writing to Ruth from the historian's office and meeting and dining with family members. On Sunday, February 14th, he started his morning at the RLDS chapel on East 2nd South for the service and was able to give a short talk. In the afternoon, he and Joseph Fielding went to the Tabernacle. On the February 24th edition of the Herald picked up the Deseret news article of February 15th about Fred's experience at the Tabernacle. He, Fred, began by assuring his hearers that it was with peculiar feelings that he stood before them to represent a religious belief that in some respects was markedly different to that believed in by his auditors. Said he, "I might spend the time so kindly given me in discussing these differences, but I doubt that would do any good. It might do some harm. But there are common grounds on which we stand, and these perhaps may be discussed before you with profit. Whether time, the great arbiter, shall soften the differences that exist between us, only the great Creator can tell. But in the divinity of Joseph Smith's mission, I believe, with you, and in this particular, we stand on common ground, ready and willing at all times to defend the position which we occupy." Fred's journal account of his experience in the Tabernacle gave us a glimpse into how he really felt that afternoon. "I was asked into the stand by C.W. Penrose, and a counselor introduced me to the audience as the son of Joseph Smith, grandson of the prophet Joseph Smith, and gave my official position in the church and as editor of the Herald. I spoke for about 25 or 30 minutes. It was hard for me. I felt depressed and alone after I sat down." While Joseph F. Smith had indicated in his letter to Edward that religion was not being discussed in their time with Fred, it was clear from this journal entry that Fred was completely aware of their differences and was struggling. That evening, Fred M. returned to the RLDS chapel and found many of his Utah relatives to be present. He wasn't feeling well, so only spent about 25 minutes speaking, but after the service, shook many hands and spent the rest of the evening chatting with family. On his last morning in the Beehive, Joseph Fielding brought out the death masks of Joseph and Hyrum to show Fred. Fred said he thought they were genuine since the bullet wound on Hyrum's face shows plainly on the left side. A year later, in the spring of 1905, Fred is called on a mission to Utah from May 1905 to March of 1906. In Larry E. Hunt's biography of Fred M., he remarks that Fred's mission to Utah was undertaken to become acquainted with the theological and sociological conditions of the former empire and to testify of the truth. Both Joseph III and Fred M. had assumed that public pressure on Mormon leaders due to the Reed Smoot investigation in Congress would cause members to rethink their religion, and it was the perfect time for the RLDS to present their claims as the true successor of the church. Reed Smoot was an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and was elected to the state legislature by the state legislature to be a senator from Utah. The congressional Smoot hearings lasted from 1904 to 1907. At the heart of the matter was the issue of polygamy, which had been officially discontinued as a practice in the church with the manifesto in 1890. However, polygamy was still privately being practiced post-1890 and by prominent church leaders such as President Joseph F. Smith. Although Smoot was a monogamist, congressional leaders were concerned that Senator Smoot would be in conflict with his position as a religious leader in a religion that was seemed to be breaking the law by continuing the practice of polygamy. The May 31st edition of the Herald noted that F.M. Smith and family had departed on the 25th for Salt Lake City, Utah. Brother Smith will begin his year's labor in the interest of the work. His efforts were to be directed towards claiming some of the lost sheep of Latter-day Israel. Fred M. wrote into the Herald upon his arrival in Salt Lake with the following report. Reached here Saturday night about midnight, having missed the connection at Colorado Springs, and have accordingly gone by the way of Denver. Having about 5 hours to wait at Denver, we looked at Brother C.E. Everett and spent a very few pleasant hours at their recently purchased home. Their hospitality afforded us an excellent opportunity to take a much appreciated rest from travel. We were very much enjoyed our journey over the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, the far-famed scenic railroad of the world. Sunday we spent with the saints in their little chapel, and until last night we found a resting place at the always open to missionaries home of Sister E. Barrows, whose kindness and caring for a wayfaring family will long be remembered. In her book concerning the prophet, Ruth Smith says of their time in Utah, "A memorable period in their lives was the 10 months we spent when my husband was yet young in the church work with our ecclesiastical cousins. A memorable visit and in many ways a pleasant one, for however people may be obliged to differ for principle's sake, they can always differ respectfully." Fred's first address to the Mormons during this trip was in an interview given in his first few days in Salt Lake. The Salt Lake Tribune printed the flattering interview on May 31st, in which Fred clarified the purpose of his visit, to see the many members of his church in Utah and the Pacific Coast. "I am fulfilling a desire which has daily been growing within me to visit them, learn of their welfare, and consider possible opportunities for the advancement of those principles of righteousness among mankind, which the prophet Joseph and his brother lived and died to establish." He went on to say that the reorganized church was not there to battle with the dominant Utah church, though he also pointed out the reorganized church followed the original teachings of the founder Joseph Smith the seer, and the Utah church had been founded by Brigham Young. Fred stated that polygamy had not been taught by Joseph Smith Jr., and RLDS members obeyed the law of the government, which meant they were clearly anti-polygamy. At the end of June, Fred writes to the Tribune about a newly announced monument to be erected at Joseph Smith Jr.'s birthplace in Vermont to honor the centennial of his birth. The July 1st edition of the Salt Lake Tribune printed the article titled "President Frederick M. Smith Protests," where he lays out his argument as to why it was wrong for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to mark the prophet's birthplace in Vermont. Chief among his complaints were: 1, Joseph Smith Jr. never as a public man taught or practiced polygamy. 2, Brigham Young usurped the presidency after the death of Joseph Jr., even though it was clearly taught by Joseph that succession should descend lineally and go to the firstborn, and that Joseph Smith Jr. had publicly named Joseph Smith III as his successor and anointed him. 3, the original law of the church stated that no man shall break the law of the land, and by practicing polygamy, the Mormon church had broken the law of the land. 4, by Mormon authorities erecting the monument, visitors to the site would naturally believe that Joseph Smith Jr. taught polygamy. Fred goes on to say that the RLDS church does not practice polygamy. The president of the church is the oldest son of Joseph Jr., as promised by the prophet. The church perpetuates the doctrines and practices of the church under Joseph, and the members of the church are known to be peaceful and law-abiding. He concludes his protest by saying, "The mission work of my life will be, as has been the mission work of my father before me, to save the good in Mormonism, to eradicate what has crept in because of the lusts of the flesh and the weakness of mankind, and to make the name of Joseph Smith honorable." As you can see, Fred M's protest wasn't merely a grandson annoyed that someone was marking his grandfather's birthplace without the consent of his children or grandchildren. We finally see in print Fred M's mission to Utah. An interesting tidbit to this protest is that Junius Wells' plans for the monument are published the very same day in the Deseret Evening News. Wells presented his plans to the LDS First Presidency on June 10th. How did Fred M. know in advance the plans to lodge his protest on this and plan to lodge his protest on the same day? Was Joseph III told of the plans and relayed them to Fred? Did Joseph Fielding confide in Fred? According to Keith A. Erickson in his paper, American Prophet New England Town, The Memory of Joseph Smith in Vermont, in the day following his protest, Fred calls on Joseph Fielding Smith to ask what he thought of it. A spirited discussion ensued that continued for the next several months, resulting in Joseph Fielding Smith's pamphlet, Origins of the Reorganized Church, The Question of Succession. In a letter to the Herald editors dated July 13th, William H. Kelly wrote, "I arrived here in Salt Lake City on July 2nd, in time to hear President Fredham's discourse at the evening meeting on lineal priesthood. Rather an awkward subject for Fred, being he is the son of his father. He did well, however, and made his points good and strong. The audience was small but attentive. Sister Fredham and Alice were present also. All well." The awkward speaks of is that Fred was a counselor in the first presidency, yet Joseph III had not yet formally made an announcement that Fredham would be his eventual successor. Despite the rhetoric playing out between the churches in the Deseret News and Salt Lake Tribune, at some point in the summer, Fredham, Ruth, Alice, Joseph Fielding and family, Senator Reed Smoot and Mrs. Smoot, and various members of the LDS hierarchy embarked on a fishing trip and picnic on Lake Utah. Ruth thought it was a delightful day until, on the return journey, a squall came upon their boats. The fury of the ocean itself is not more sudden nor treacherous than when the wind whips up out of nowhere and the great green waves come smashing across the helpless prow. Ruth began to feel seasick. Senator Smoot, seeing her in distress, reached over to pick up Alice and placed her firmly between his knees while the boat continued to struggle in the waves. Ruth goes on to say that even in years later, when she pictured Senator Smoot working in Washington, she always remembered how he had once protected my child when I was too ill and too frightened to know whether she was beside me. Incidentally, Fredham and Joseph Fielding had been fishing from a dinghy tied to the larger boat during the storm. The larger boat hobbled. Ruth instructed the captain to cut her husband and his cousin loose, leaving them to get to shore on their own. Fred and Joseph Fielding never let her forget she had cut them loose in the middle of the storm, but she had every confidence they could row themselves back to shore. On the return train trip to town, Julina Smith, Joseph Fielding Smith's mother, said to Ruth that she hoped Fred would never say or do anything to hurt her son. Ruth replied that she was confident that Fredham would, for I knew that Fred was entirely too young and too positive to consider the feelings of his relatives in the work that he should do in the city. Ruth worried that she had offended Julina with her frankness, but their friendly relationship endured through the years. Continuing his mission, Fredham submitted an open letter to the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, printed in the July 28, 1905 Salt Lake Tribune as a note of warning from the seed of Joseph Smith, Jr. In his warning, Fred reiterates the rightful succession in the priesthood is lineal, and polygamy was not taught by Joseph Smith. He states that Brigham Young was also a false prophet in that, had Brigham Young and his fellows remained true to their apostolic calling, carefully guarding the interests of the church, and had been free of aspiration and ambition to stand in the place of the seed of Joseph, and had thus awaited in patience the time when the Lord should bring one of the seed of Joseph to the church, today Mormonism so-called, would have been one of the leading religious influences in the United States and the world, feared and respected because of its power and righteousness. Fred ends his warning by letting the members know that while they've been led astray since the death of Joseph, it's not too late. Arise and repent and prepare yourselves to enter more fully into the work of redeeming Zion, that glorious consummation made possible only by an intense spiritual development. The work of the end is ushered in. The voice of the Spirit to the seed of Joseph Smith has been and is to hasten the work. For Zion must be redeemed, and great spirituality is essential. The gathering place is appointed, and the reorganized church is established there. Will the cry be heeded? As one can imagine, Fred's missives were not received well among the leaders and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Fredham does, however, find support for his warning among Herald readers. In a letter dated August 21st, 1905, to the editor, J.F. Burton in Bakersfield, California writes in to say they have read Fred's address to the people of the Church of Jesus Christ, and how kindly, how lovingly the Holy Spirit pleads with those who honor Joseph, the martyred prophet of God, pleading with them to honor him by following his counsel, by his posterity, under the inspirational power of his office. How complete that call, how kind the pleadings are, how exact the statements, how charitably the errors are mentioned, how clear the warning voice. May our Father in heaven help them come out on the Lord's side. On August 21st, Fred M. takes the rather bold step of writing to President Joseph F. Smith to inquire if he, as a seed of Joseph, would be permitted to use LDS meeting houses throughout Utah. It is my purpose to make a thorough canvass of the state of Utah and other parts of the country in which your people are numerous, as circumstances will permit, for the purpose of delivering my message, and when I have done so, then my responsibility in this particular work shall have ceased, and that of the people begins, so far as my call is concerned. How kind of Fred to let Joseph F. know that he'll leave as soon as he gets his message out. Fred goes on to say, as you well know, I feel that you and your people have, to an extent more or less, greatly wandered away from the truth as established by Joseph Smith the prophet, and as one of the seed of that man, there rests upon me the serious duty of calling to repentance those who have wandered thus. I have made the call through such channels as have been open to me, and it is my determination to do all in my power to give all your people a chance to hear the call. I am most sincere and earnest, for I feel that dire consequences are sure to follow the refusal of your people to heed the call. No amount of ridicule hurled at me, no amount of derision will forestall such consequences. As you can imagine, President Smith does not think Fred, despite his earnestness, should deliver the message to the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and especially not in their own meeting houses. In his reply, President Smith, in essence, rejects Fred's request. He reminds Fred that while he is a seed of Joseph, he is in the wrong church with no authority to address the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And despite the fact that Joseph III believes his father was not a polygamist, he was, according to Joseph F. and the testimony of hundreds of others. President Joseph F. does offer a small olive branch at the end of the letter. Now, sir, before I conclude, I solemnly call upon you to repent of misrepresenting the man whom God called to usher in the great dispensation of the fullness of times, and also of officiating in the ordinances of the gospel without authority. With only the best of feelings and with a desire for your spiritual welfare, I remain in sincerity your kinsman. RLDS missionary A.M. Chase wrote to the Herald from Ogden, Utah, we have the promise of the Bishop of Malad, Idaho, that commencing Monday, the 4th of September, Brother F.M. Smith and myself may occupy their tabernacle for 1 week. At present, we are busy upon the streets here. All goes well with us so far. So this is probably my favorite picture as part of this presentation, and it shows you what a street preaching outfit looked at in 1905. The stand featured an organ, podium, preaching chart, in the upper right corner, flag, backdrop, and as far as I can tell, the only thing missing from this is a potluck. So I think that's pretty charming there. During the summer of 1905, Joseph Smith III, his wife Ada, and their 3 toddler sons take an extended trip to the West, including Montana, Idaho, Washington, Vancouver, British Columbia, and California, with their final stop being a visit to Fred, Ruth, and Alice in Salt Lake City. Joseph and his family arrived at the end of September. One of Joseph and Fred M.'s first meetings during the visit was with members of the New Party, a group of men with political ambitions that did not align with the Mormon Church. Joseph said the group called the New Party at that time was zealous in its efforts to overcome the powerful church interests dominant in the city. In prior visits to Salt Lake, Joseph would meet with groups of men and ministers of other faiths, only to find they would not acknowledge him if they happened to pass him on the sidewalk. He was delighted to meet with F.J. Cannon, son of George Q. Cannon, and former Senator Thomas J. Kearns. It was arranged that we should lunch with him, Cannon, at the leading hotel of the city, and enjoyed a long and interesting conversation with them over Utah conditions in general. The meeting must have gone mutually well, as Fred M. and Joseph III were invited later in the week to a second lunch at the home of Thomas J. Kearns. Others present on that occasion were Colonel Wall, Colonel Wood, Dr. Padden, Dr. Keith, and Messrs. Cannon and H.G. McMillan. Dr. Keith seemed to be the center of the strong political effort being made to defeat the church faction in electing a senator. Colonel Wall held significant power in the political arena. McMillan was a wealthy mine owner, merchant, and banker, and Dr. Padden was pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and Colonel Wood was also an active politician. These 5 men were fair representatives of the temper and political tone of the wealthy businessmen in the city. Joseph III said, thinking about that luncheon, I was convinced that the most plausible explanation for us being invited was that these men desired to measure our calibers as individuals and leaders with a view of ascertaining what possible value to them our people might become in their general political movements. Most of them were schemers, as I believe representative of a certain considerable strata in political society, and were apparently more or less under the tutelage of Senator Kearns and F.J. Cannon. Joseph was pleased to find that when they did see Senator Kearns while out on the walk, the senator not only warmly acknowledged Joseph, but introduced him to the group he was out with. Reverend Padden also, on another occasion, was cordial to Joseph Smith III. In her book, Ruth Smith says, with the arrival of Father Smith in Salt Lake City, our difficulties deepened. With the older men, the differences that sprang up between the two churches at the time of their division seemed insurmountable. Though friends and relatives often called with the most cousinly of feelings, and though our table was often drawn to its full length that Brother Joseph might meet his friends and relatives in the pleasantest of social capacities, their conversations usually developed into arguments of a decided heat and edge. An example of one of these social visits can be found in a record by Angus M. Cannon, former Salt Lake State president and a childhood friend of Joseph Smith III from Nauvoo, who called on him while in residence at Fred M.'s on October 12th. The purpose of the visit, according to Cannon, was to relay to Joseph III how he had come to be in Utah and join the LDS Church. They reminisced about their school days in Monroe School at the Red Brick Store. Angus told of the kindness he had experienced from the Smith family, especially Joseph III's Aunt Lucy, when he and his siblings were waiting to depart for the West. I very well remember that your father's sister Lucy came to us as we were camped by the Laws steam mill, waiting to be ferried over the river, and the sympathy she manifested for us. Cannon spoke of his rebaptism once reaching Salt Lake due to imperfect records from his first baptism in the Mississippi River at Nauvoo, his reluctance at the thought of polygamy, and his eventual acceptance of the principle of polygamy. He proceeded to ask Joseph III what he knew of his father's involvement in polygamy, going so far as to name the women who were thought to have been his plural wives. The information Cannon presented was not new to either Joseph III or Fred M., although it must have been disappointing to have to listen to an old friend describe Emma as having lost her spirit because she married Louis Bideman. Cannon also implied that Joseph III himself was a polygamist because he had remarried the 2 times he had been widowed, knowing that Joseph III was vehemently anti-polygamy. During the course of the visit, which lasted over 4 hours, Fred M., according to Cannon, only interrupted once at a point where Cannon was giving his testimony of the site of the priesthood restoration. At the end of the visit, as Cannon rose to depart, Fred M. said, "Brother Cannon, you must not depart without breaking bread with us." Cannon joined them for dinner and was introduced to Ruth, who he described as a very pleasant lady, who made me quite welcome. Cannon felt the visit ended with kind feelings. Joseph III's remembrance of this meeting was slightly different, as noted in his memoirs. Studying the man Angus, I could not help but feel a conviction that the loss of prestige and spiritual power as a leader which he had suffered had its influence in putting him in a temper to give the cause of the church away. He placed no restriction upon us in regard to the speech he made in our presence about the major portion of his brethren who had entered into plural marriage being hypocrites and dishonest. The result of this interview, as I have said, was that both Fred and I were satisfied that if the real truth could be brought out, the charge he made regarding hypocrisy of his brethren and their adoption and adaptation of polygamous practices was a just one, and that it applied to himself as well as to others. Joseph Fielding Smith publishes The Reorganized Church versus the Salvation of the Dead while Joseph Smith III is in town. According to an ad in the Deseret Evening News, it was a 32-page pamphlet for sale by the Deseret News bookstore, 30 cents a dozen or 2 for 5 cents. In the document, Joseph Fielding argues that the Reorganites, a term he coins meant to slander the RLDS, who had generally been known in Utah as the Josephites, are not the true successors of the original church because they do not perform baptisms for the dead, as the title implies. On December 19, 1905, Ruth writes to her Aunt Betty from Salt Lake and gives us a personal glimpse at what Ruth, Fred, and Alice had been up to in Utah in the preceding months. Notably, she calls their time there various and peculiar. She wrote, "I am president of the Religio Sunday School, which means oh so much work in a branch like this. Some of our finest families are disgusted with everything and scarcely, if ever, come out to church. We are trying so hard to improve the branch here, but there is so much to contend with in different ways. At first, President Joseph F. Smith and family, and other notables, among them Senator Smoot, entertained us royalty. We heard from them, and those that knew, that they were going to get Frederick M. Smith, and they were rejoicing. Frederick was in the meantime burning the midnight oil, studying the best ways to attack them. Fred is here to tell them the truth as he sees it, no matter what it costs us personally. In many ways, the fight is very disagreeable." Ruth mentions that the Salt Lake Tribune welcomed publishing Fred's letters and articles directed at the Mormons, and the Deseret News regularly publishes responses to Fred's articles. Ruth has spent much of the preceding months attending Utah State University lectures on English literature and psychology. She said, "The way I managed to get acquainted with students and faculty and talk the Josephite gospel is amusing to Fred. I tell him I make it part of my university work to advertise the Josephites." Ruth ends the letter by mentioning that Alice goes to school in the mornings and that Fred thinks she's an unusually smart little girl. And on our screen now is a letter that we've just come across in the past few weeks, which is more of a writing sample of Alice that says, "Dear Papa, I thank you very much for the nice present that you gave me and all you have done for me. Your loving friend, Alice Smith." And the corner caption says, "The present is a mechanical writing toy recently brought from Des Moines, Iowa. This letter was written March 6, 1905 by my daughter, Alice, who will be 6 years old on the 29th of the month. She has never been to school, but learns readily. This will be a curiosity to her a few years hence. Fred M. Smith, March 6, 1905. Fred M., Ruth, and Alice returned home to Lamoni on March 13, 1906. Section 127 of the Doctrine and Covenants was approved by the April RLDS General Conference. Verse 6 reads, "It is the will of the Lord that the mission to Utah and the West should be continued, and suitable representatives of the church be sent and maintained there under the conditions prevailing at the present time. It is essential that the church have proper representatives there." Interestingly, this is the only instance that Utah is mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. Verses 8b through c reads, "It is now declared that in the case of the removal of my servant now presiding over the church by death or transgression, my servant Frederick M. Smith, if he remain faithful and steadfast, should be chosen, in accordance with the revelations which have hitherto been given to the church concerning the priesthood. Should my servant Frederick M. Smith prove unstable and unfaithful, another may be chosen according to the law given." Fred would become the third prophet president of the church after the death of his father in 1914. He would guide the church through both world wars, the flu pandemic of 1918, and the Great Depression. He was a strong leader, and I think Ruth's book concerning the prophet, published in 1924, was meant to show church members that there was more to Fred than his position in the church. Today, descendants of Fred and Ruth's are members of Community of Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and other churches. They continue to gather with their cousins from Utah, most recently at the Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith family reunion last year in Nauvoo. Many more visits were made to Utah in Fred M's lifetime. In her book, Ruth shares a parting thought on their relationship with Utah. I cannot claim that there have never been any thorns among the compliments which have passed between the hands of the cousins in Utah and their contemporaries in the Middle West. But with all our respective differences, are we not cousins? And if in the coming years, with wise care and intelligent cultivation, we shall have destroyed all these thorns, I cannot but believe that we shall find that same eliminating process of horticulture has been at work in the Garden of Utah. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That was fantastic. The image of the young Grant McMurray and Dick Howard to end with that image was the best. Thank you for that. This night exceeded my expectations, and I had high expectations. Thank you so much. I hope it's the first of many lectures that you do with us. You certainly garnered a lot of interest tonight. I also want to thank Seth for joining us and Lexi for helping us out from behind the scenes and making it all look so easy. And lastly, I share our thanks to you in the audience for coming out tonight, for supporting the Historic Sites Foundation, and for continuing to read your church history. And speaking of church history, I encourage you all to tune in next week for our next lecture in the fall series. Our friends Nancy Ross and David Howlett will share with us their research on RLDS feminism. Their lecture is called Becoming More Aware, RLDS Feminist Activism in the 1970s. So follow the link that Lexi will drop into the chat to register for the lecture happening on Thursday, November 16th at 7 p.m. You can get to it through our fall lecture series webpage as well. So until then, friends, keep reading your church history, take care, and have a good night.